Let's get started. So, hello to everyone. Welcome to the third annual Sister Cities Conference presented by Global Cleveland and the Cleveland Public Library. This event is a celebration of the strong partnerships Cleveland has created with her 23 sister cities and a roadmap for future collaboration. Global Cleveland understands that the key to strengthening our region is welcoming our world, and we are grateful to be joined by international experts today to speak about mobility. My name is Fatima Rahman, or Fatima. I am the Cleveland Foundation Fellow at Global Cleveland and part of the leadership team for the Sister Cities Conference. And I'm excited to welcome you to this panel discussion. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors for supporting this event. The sponsors for our 2021 Sister Cities Conference are Swagalock, Medical Mutual, Platform Brewery, Irish, the Links Inc., The Corner 65, Us Together, and 12 Literary Arts. In addition to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Global Cleveland, they have partnered with Italian Tours by Diana to send 2 lucky travelers to Cleveland's sister city, Vicenza, Italy. This 8-day Italian journey will introduce you to Vicenza, Venice, Florence, Rome, and beautiful destinations in between. Sign up to win at globalcleveland.org. Lastly, mark your calendars for our 2022 Sister Cities Conference to join us here in Cleveland for our hybrid event. The conference will be in person as well as streamed virtually the week of October 17, 2022. I will now introduce our moderator, India Birdsong. Ms. Birdsong is the Chief Executive Officer and General Manager of Cleveland RTA. Director Birdsong has served in this role since 2019 and has the unique ability to see opportunities and build upon them, create support systems, and dedicate her team to the benefit of the organization and community she serves. She does so by expertly balancing multiple competing interests as a mother, CEO, and a civic leader. At RTA, Director Birdsong oversees more than 2,000 employees at the largest transit system in Ohio, which provides more than 17 million annual rides to customers using the bus, rail, paratransit, trolley, and bus rapid transit system across the county's 457 square miles. Responsible for managing the authority's $247 million operating budget, Director Birdsong is committed to transparent leadership, management, accountability, and sound financial oversight. We are grateful to have Director Birdsong moderate this panel. And I'll send it to you, Ms. Birdsong.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I appreciate the hearing about yourself. So it's great to be able to be here today. As Fatima stated, this discussion will center around public transportation being used as a tool for economic development in cities across the day. Hailing from Bangalore, we first have Dr. Ashish Verma, and then we have Dr. Ashwin Mahesh. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here with us today. Our Professional Lab, or the IST Lab. He is a PhD from IIT Bombay and currently serving as Associate Professor of Transportation Systems Engineering at Department of Civil Engineering at the Center for Infrastructure, Sustainable Transportation, and Urban Planning, and Robert Bosch Center for Cyber Physical Systems at Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, India. He has authored more than 195 research publications in the area of sustainable transportation and road safety. He has also authored multiple books on public transport and is the founding and current president of the Society Transportation Research Group of India, also known as TRG. He is presently serving as steering and scientific committee member of World Conference on Transport Research Society, other known as WCTRS, based in the University of Leeds in the UK. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We also have with us, oh, absolutely. We also have with us Dr. Ashwin Mahesh. Dr. Mahesh is a social technologist and urbanist based in Bangalore, India as well. He studied to be an Antarctic climate scientist and an astronomer, but after dozens of years in scientific research, he switched over to a career lab, Impunity, which builds platforms and tools for urban problems public solving. He edits the National Public Affairs Journal, India Together, and also leads the work of the How Institute, which is a center for problem solving based on collaborations between state, market, and society. He is also a co-founder of Lithium, which operates the first and largest fleet of electric cars in India. He has held research positions at several leading academic institutions and also served briefly in state government. He is awarded the Fellowship, Scotia Fellowship for Social Entrepreneurship in 2009. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. You'll have to correct me, Doctor, if we would do that. We appreciate you being here with us as well.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I think if it's okay with you, Fatima, we'll get into the questions here. We have quite a few for both of you gentlemen. You have some very interesting backgrounds with a plethora of experience and research. It's my pleasure to be able to have this discussion with you today. We will start with speaking about basically where we are now in the world state of a pandemic. It's definitely a different kind of time for us, not only in public transit, but also worldwide. One of our first questions here has rolled in. It is the pandemic has greatly impacted the capacity of public transit as well as the perception of safety. What changes do you anticipate in the public transport arena in the near future? And we'll start with you, Dr. Mahesh.
You know, we in cities like Bangalore, there has historically been an undersupply of public transport solutions. And therefore, while the pandemic certainly reduced the availability of public transport considerably, even at reduced usage of the system, the demand and the need for public transport is so high that inevitably, whatever be the health situation, whatever be the risks that people take, and whatever be their fears about it, I believe that in time, and perhaps that means in about 6 to 12 months, we should expect to see largely the levels of pre-pandemic mobility using public transport in Bangalore, certainly, and in many other places in India. I think the alternatives are simply not in place to do anything other than this at the moment. The only constraint that I see is that service providers, who tend to be primarily owned by the government, service providers may be slow to reintroduce the full availability of their services. And that might slow down how quickly these things come back. But the actual demand, I suspect, is already there.
Is there something wrong?
I'm not sure. I think there's some difficulty.
I can't hear anyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
I think she's
I
having
see
some
you
trouble.
and I can hear you.
Your connection tends to break in between.
Okay, I actually think his screen may be frozen right now. Okay. If you can hear me, then we would go ahead with the first question. Dr. Verma, I'll move over to you. Really wanted to be able to talk about the pandemic and safety as a tenet of public service, especially public transportation. Because safety has been greatly impacted by the pandemic, what changes do you anticipate in public transit in the near future?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very important question. You know, the most ironic part with public transport has been while they're mass carriers, they also became mass carrier or major carrier of a virus risk during this pandemic time. Um, Interestingly, when the first wave started last year in April and May, I actually initiated a special issue for one of the top transportation journals, Transport Policy, on transport policy in post COVID-19 world. And when I actually got a lot of submissions from different parts of the world, uh, bringing empirical case studies of how public transport have been impacted, how transportation system have impacted, how policies have and governments have reacted to it. It's a uniform, I would say, story across the world of how public transport has been badly hit. It's not just Bangalore or some city in developing economy, but equally in developed economy. I think the impact has been seen everywhere. Uh, I think for public transport to survive this pandemic and not just come back to its pre-COVID level, but also uh, become more common and attractive mode of transport going further post-COVID-19 world. Um, as Ashwin also pointed out, in Bangalore, we have seen an undersupply of public transport. Uh, Whether you take the public buses or you take the mass rapid transit system like metro rail systems or suburban rail systems, they are actually at a very nascent, level of development in our cities. Mostly in Bangalore, we hardly have about 40 to 50 kilometers of operational length of metro rail system presently for a city which is past 10 million population already. It's like a small drop in the ocean, kind of, in terms of supply. So going further, to rejuvenate public transport, I think adequate supply, and that's where government needs to focus: incentivization to use public transport and prioritization for movement of public transport, whether it is public buses on roads, or any other kinds of priority treatment that you can give. I think these are some key building blocks or pillars for ensuring that public transport regains its attractiveness or improve it further and attract more and more people. Incentivization will ensure people to get enticed to use it even when there is some hitch about virus risk or risk of pandemic and so on. And during this pandemic, I have seen, again, from those empirical research articles that I've seen from different parts of the world, many countries and cities have tried different incentivization schemes during this pandemic time to see that metro rail systems or public buses remains attractive. People come to it. More miles people travel, they give more points on that, and one can redeem them. There are a lot of those things happen. So I think these are key things that governments can focus: uh, uh, adequate supply, incentivization, and prioritizing public transport. I think that's the way probably will ensure public transport uh, gets back to its glory. Back to you.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. You hit on a lot of interesting points that have been subject of a lot of debates here in the United States, which I'm sure has been the same in India. I would like to, and I'll hit on a couple of those and come back to you with a few more follow-up questions as we move through it. I do see Dr. Mahesh is still on with us. He is frozen from my screen, but if you can hear me, Dr. Mahesh, if you'd like to take a stab at answering that question as well, please go ahead.
No, what I said earlier, and I think you're still having difficulty with my screen, is that public transport systems will continue to be important, and they will come back to reasonably high levels of utilization by the public fairly quickly once the mass risk of the virus starts to fade. And here, in some ways, you can already see that. I think the more interesting question is what other patterns of urbanization have been altered by the pandemic, and not really think about mobility as the only thing being addressed. I think if employment clusters are behaving differently, if housing is is changing in some way, you're going to see new patterns of mobility and new patterns of need for mobility emerge from these changes as well. So and unfortunately, while you can do a lot with the bus system, there's not a whole lot different that you can do with the metro system when these patterns change. I think there's going to be a fair amount of rejig in terms of where people live. There is one thing that we're clearly seeing in the cities now is more people considering options to move to the suburbs and even outside the city, which calls for a very different kind of public transport system and a public transport governance system as well. I think these things will be important changes. And to cope with these changes, we will need to have a far more nimble and responsive system of public transport than in the past, because I think being able to plan for steady state and slow changes in mobility for a couple of years, I think we have to set that aside and respond to more COVID-driven changes that may be temporary but are significantly different from the average patterns that have existed in the last few years.
Yeah, I heard you quite clearly. I think our moderator probably is trying to get back. I can see a message in the chat.
So maybe we can continue the conversation while we wait for her in some way. What do you think about this whole suburbanization? Because the public transport system in many cities doesn't really reach the suburbs significantly, and it's concentrated in historical town centers and built-up areas, which are not the places where populations are growing. And the pandemic has moved more people into these outlying areas. Are we going to see a lot more sunk costs, especially in things like metro, because the need patterns are now far more dispersed than in the past?
It's a challenging question. The issue is with people moving to suburbs, you definitely see much less densification or less dense development in the suburb areas, which is not conducive to sustain a metro rail connectivity to those areas. So it's a challenge if you have to ensure that people living in suburban areas are also using public transport as a choice of mobility option or a mode option, unless of course it is of a superior quality in the sense compared to their own car or personal vehicle that they might have choice to use. It's difficult to sustain a public transport and get people on board to public transport. One way to possibly still induce people to use public transport would be to have park and ride, a good park and ride or kiss and ride kind of facilities. I have seen in many of the US cities also where people living in suburban areas, I've seen in Washington DC also, whenever in January I go for TRP and I stay in suburban location with my friends. So they drive me to the nearest metro station at the kiss and ride point, and then I'm able to take the metro and rail services. Maybe that kind of system can still possibly help us people not bring their vehicles into the congested part of the city, and we can sustain the public transport system. But the pitfall is, with people spreading out in suburbs, you keep increasing the urban sprawl. That makes things more challenging in terms of providing services, in each area in different parts of the city. So it has complexity, whereas has also its own advantages. You can even build kind of built environment that can bring more people on walking and cycling in a compact city with probably more densification rather than more horizontally spread cities. So
One thing that sort of strikes me is in the past when jobs were there in the city center and people could converge on the city centers from multiple directions. So there was a logical reason for concentrations of jobs in a certain part of the city, and then you sort of take advantage of that by having people come from different directions. But what we're seeing now, definitely in Bangalore and other places, is that the jobs are increasingly not in the city center. The jobs are close in the suburb. When the jobs are in the suburbs, you're not really seeing convergence to the work zone areas from every direction. Really, you're getting people traveling to an eastern job concentration site like Whitefield only from the city or only from a few directions. In effect, when the jobs move to the suburbs, you're getting almost nobody come to those jobs from half the semicircle around that point. And is there a logic for thinking that is there a reason we should be thinking that rather than one public transport system, you treat every major job cluster as needing its own imagination of what the public transport system to that geography should be, and concentrate the urban planning around that rather than continue to think of the city as a whole in the old way that you did.
yeah. So I think in one way, this kind of moving out of job and creating more clusters in different parts of the city is in a way good if we can support it with targeted policy and planning interventions. And when I say that, what I mean is if people are able to live closer to the places where they have these job locations, then it makes it very easy for more sustainable transportation system, in the sense people with shorter distances can easily take to walk and cycle or other green modes or green ways of travel. And it would also reduce the requirement for heavy capacity mass transit systems, because you don't have now these high density or high volume corridors getting into the city center where everybody has to come for job, just like Mumbai, for example, where Mumbai is also spread out, but you still have a strong South Mumbai cluster of jobs, and traditionally everybody used to come with very high demand corridors of these railways, urban railway corridors, and huge peak demand, directional demands, morning from north to south, and then in the evening from south to north. So avoiding that can actually help us have a situation where you don't really need a heavy capacity, mass transit system, and you can actually have these clusters kind of more self-contained, probably with some travel happening between these clusters, but that can still happen with much lesser requirement of heavy capacity public transport system. So that way, actually, you can really, sustain the city very well. But this really requires some strong policy interventions also, along with planning interventions, in the sense that people should be incentivized to be closer, to be living closer to where they work. So some way of doing that has to happen. Otherwise, you may have these clusters, but somebody here is actually living in some other place. Doesn't make sense that way.
Well, I observed that in two states in particular, in Tamil Nadu and in Gujarat, and I think one could make this general observation about a lot of countries, that the states with better connectivity between the county capitals, or what we call the district capitals, tend to develop a certain kind of transportation system, which is far more of a network that touches multiple parts of large regional geographies. And states that don't have strong connectivity between county capitals tend to end up with entirely city-based systems in one or two large cities, And whatever you try to do in those large cities, you're not really impacting how you could leverage good mobility in any other part of the state. And one could pick a state even like Ohio to say, look, having 6 cities that are well connected to each other also impacts patterns of mobility, in addition to what Cleveland or Toledo or any of these places can do independently in some way. I think there's even this business of staying close to your place of work is not something you need to think about only in the large city. A lot of people in the large city aren't really from the large city. For them, staying close to their place of work could mean staying close to where they originally are from, rather than come to a major city and then try to solve that problem.
Yeah. I think we have our moderator back. You can hear us?
Yes, I can hear everyone now. Sorry about that. We had a little bit of a a technical thing going on, but yes.
We just try to manage the show in your absence. Please.
You're doing a fantastic job. I wouldn't expect anything less from 2 doctors. So just to kind of recap on what you've been talking about here, thinking about how we think differently in terms of travel pattern due to pandemic, thinking about how we bolster ridership in this kind of situation we have globally. And then also a reconstruction of the routing. I know that here in Cleveland, we've actually undergone a restructuring of our bus network, not in response to the pandemic, but right as we're emerging from the pandemic. Hopefully we don't go through another surge, but I'm sure that's on people's minds in other areas such as Bangalore as well. How do you attack or how do you work with the idea of a restructuring of your routing, a restructuring of working from home? I know that I believe I heard Dr. Mahesh sort of talking about the changes that may be going on with your ridership demographics. How do you work toward revising and revamping a transit system that is constantly changing as companies are closing and opening and doing a lot of virtual things as well? How can we sort of rely on the statistics that we normally did before in ridership, knowing that they change every day? I'll open that up to whomever you want to answer.
I mean, there is a governance limitation as well, which is that the way public transport management is organized in India tends to imagine public transport inside out, as it were. That is, it's sort of in the imagination of a transport planner. The public transport system begins in downtown business districts of a city and somehow spirals or reaches radially away from those downtowns externally. Unfortunately, the population changes no longer mimic this way of thinking about the city, and that's really the problem today. That and in coastal cities like Cleveland, this is actually an even bigger problem, because you could go to any coastal city in the world and you'll find a concentration of of legislatures and city councils and business districts along the waterfront, and people used to live in suburbs and commute to these areas for work. But now you've got a situation where there's a far more dispersed distribution of the places that people work at. But your public transport system is not the only thing you're stuck with. You're stuck with the administration of that public transport system as well. With that, the people who run that show tend to think from the city outward. So it's much harder for them to say, now I'm going to think as though I was the public
Dr. Verma, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Ashish, you can hear her?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yes.
Okay, I can hear and see you the same way as before, but Dr. Mahesh is frozen for me. Fatima,
I can hear you.
it's okay. You can't see me?
Yeah, we're good. I don't know why your screen is frozen, but we're good.
I can
Maybe
see and hear you just fine, but I can't hear or see Dr. Mahesh. What I may do
Oh,
is either go ahead. I'm sorry.
Ashish,
yeah.
you should assure her that both of us are audible to everybody else.
Yes, yes, yes. Actually, I can
Because
clearly
she can
hear.
hear only you, she can't hear me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm able to clearly hear Ashwin. Probably, if somebody, yeah, I can see a message from Deepa that they can hear both the speakers. Um,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So whatever Ashwin said, everybody heard except you.
Oh my goodness. What I will do at this point, I think, just for to make sure that we can continue and appreciate your time, I'm going to ask Rosarita to go ahead, or I'm sorry, Fatima to go ahead and take over for me. I will put my questions in the chat if that's okay, and that way we'll go ahead and continue because I do have a couple questions myself, and I want to make sure I give both of you an opportunity to
Yeah,
respond.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about this. I can hear both of you fine.
yeah.
Um, if Dr. Mahesh, you want to continue on what you were doing, and then Ms. Birdsong, if you just want to enter those questions in the chat, and I'll ask them so our audience can hear them as well.
So what I
Perfect.
was
Thank you so
saying,
much.
yeah, thank you. What I was saying is that if you are a city planner and you've been planning with a certain spatial imagination of the city, and the city then starts to grow outward or away from that spatial imagination, now you have to think for that new spatial imagination. But you're not in charge of that new spatial imagination unless the governance structure already allows for that. And in some states, including in Cleveland, you're not far from the state border. So if you have a metropolitan growth which starts to spill over into what? What's east of you? Pennsylvania. So if it starts to spill over into Pennsylvania, you don't really get to sit in Ohio and plan for that new distribution of people that somebody in Pennsylvania has to do. You'll need some kind of a coordination council between Northeast Ohio and Northwestern Pennsylvania or something like that. So essentially, because the governance structures are not in place for the new patterns of living and work that are emerging, it's not a simple matter to say, this is how I'm going to redo my public transport system because of that word, my public transport system. Your public transport system is just yours, and it really cannot serve new patterns of mobility until we figure out how to make it more than just our public transport system. And we have this problem here in Bangalore too. We're a city very close to two other state borders. And there's a lot of economic activity that spills over into neighboring states. It's very difficult to plan comprehensive mobility, housing, water supply, all sorts of things for a large metropolitan area that isn't in one state. And when patterns begin to change even within that, then you're really stuck.
Thank you. I'm going to reiterate that as best as I can so we can have Ms. Birdsong just kind of knowing what's happening. So as you said, it's difficult as a transportation leader in one city to plan for things that aren't in our city. So for example, as you said, Cleveland is on the border of Pennsylvania, is less than 3 hours from New York, is on the other side, we have Chicago, Illinois close, we have Michigan close. So how can we as transportation leaders in Cleveland make those routes basically available, even though they're not in our municipality or in our region? Dr. Verma, do you have anything that you would like to add specifically on that topic or any way that I did not communicate that correctly?
No, I think you summed it up well, and in many ways, I mean, again, when I look at Bangalore and look at it in the context of the state of Karnataka, of which Bangalore is the capital, we have a very peculiar situation in the sense that while Bangalore is connected very well by all modes, to rest of the country, to international, destinations. But within the state of Karnataka, we have a much inferior or poor connectivity to other destinations, other key destinations, whether it is tourist spots or places which are industry focused or mining areas and so on and so forth. And so if somebody has to think about a more sustainable and uniform economic development, and also decongesting Bangalore. uh, it's populated kind of beyond its capacity. We are not able to supply power, water, etc. to such huge population. So to decongest Bangalore also, it's important. So I wrote a paper some 7 years back on how a high-speed connectivity of Bangalore to many of these key locations in a network way can actually help spread sustainable urbanization and also spread out economic opportunity, allow these other cities to grow. So, for example, somebody choosing to stay closer in Bangalore to its job location with much higher residential cost can as well choose to stay in another small city like Mysore, which is a town closer to Bangalore with a high-speed connectivity and almost travel in the same time which you are presently taking to travel from one part of the city to the other in the congested traffic. That kind of arrangement can actually not just sustain in bigger cities like Bangalore, but also help other cities to grow up. It can also help industries to spread out and choose these other locations where setting establishment cost may not be high, and so on. So, likewise, a similar analogy can apply in the context of Cleveland and these other connections that you mentioned.
Absolutely. Ms. Birdsong, did you hear that? Do you want to add anything or do you want me to continue?
If you can go ahead and continue, I'm just going to test drive this for a little bit until I'm sure that I don't have any issues. I do have another question in the chat, and I'll continue to put them in there, but this is really fascinating.
Okay,
I
great.
can't hear
So
you
we
now.
actually just had a question in the chat. I'm going to bring this up from Deepa, who I know is close acquaintances with you, Ashwin Mahesh. So thank you, Deepa, so much. So she asked, in the US, cities are trying to be creative in promoting walkability. For example, Maryland Planning is collaborating with Maryland Department of Transportation to host a series of walk-in-hours spotlighting pedestrian safety, health, and commuting options, and Maryland's walk programs and initiatives. Can you share a few, and Ms. Birdsong, this is open to you as well. Can you share a few best practices or collaboration that could be beneficial to Cleveland, which is a city that continues to lose its population and is a city that has many spread out suburbs, which is one of the issues, I think, with the public transportation?
So historically, the city was a place of mass employment in manufacturing, right? In the making of goods. That's what produced clusters of people coming together and living together. Increasingly, however, our large cities are trying to almost entirely rid themselves of manufacturing. They don't want to see any factory anywhere if they can help it. But I think this is for understandable reasons, because industrial activity is associated with levels of pollution and environmental degradation that people are trying to stay away from. But I think there is an important exception that can be made, which has a climate focus as well. I believe that we should allow remanufacturing in the city. Manufacturing from extracted resources is very different from remanufacturing from products that are already made and are simply refabricated to create new possibilities out of them. So our reuse, recycling, refabrication industries don't really need to be outside the city. And I think with a little more attention to this question, one could come up with a subset of manufacturing activity that could continue to happen inside the city and produce significant amounts of concentrated employment. And the reason to push for this is that concentrated employment is the backbone of a public transport system that remains economically viable. That the push towards suburbanization of the population effectively undermines the economic viability of the transport system, because the per kilometer distance that every person starts to travel starts to increase, and then the costs of provisioning that system are much higher. So you really have to say, what are the things that I can be doing to ensure that people continue to be attracted to dense living in the city? Not just dense living, but dense living in the city that already exists. And that's not entirely a mobility question. It's a question about employment, it's a question about housing, it's a question about social infrastructure like schools and hospitals and things like that. And also, it's a question about integration between people of different income groups, people of different age groups, and all of the stratification that we've seen occur in city after city, not just in America, but in India and everywhere else in the world. I still think that as urbanists, the majority of people are still trying to solve what I call techno-managerial problems. But the problems are actually social and political. They're not technical and managerial. That if we don't begin to grapple with them as social and political problems, I don't think we'll ever get close to solving them as technical and managerial problems.
I think that's a great point, and that's something that I was going to bring up. And I will admit I have limited history or limited knowledge of Cleveland, as I'm a transplant here, and mobility, as I work in education and nonprofit. But from what I understand is that the reason that these Rust Belt cities became a growing population is, like you said, because of those factories and those manufacturing in the cities, so people would move there. But now we have an equity issue, right? And we understand kind of like the history of, I think it's called like white flight, where people kind of fled these populated areas, moved out to the suburbs, and now we're focusing on the opposite. And as you said, I think mobility is a kind of an equity issue, but also in a way that if people who are in higher income classes are not seeing this as a priority because they don't need it, because they can drive cars, because they have other ways to get around, they don't necessarily need to go there, then that is impacting our lower income neighbors, because then the transportation is not going to be as quality, and it's not going to go, quite frankly, to where people need to go. It's not going to go where the businesses are, where the schools are, where families need to be, where growing families, young people, everyone need to be.
If I can jump in, if go ahead, Dr. Verma, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Yeah, just on this question of Deepa on walkability and some best practices, actually, in Bangalore, we, in last, I would say, 9-10 months, we did some interesting experiment. It was called Church Street First Test Bed. Now, Church Street is one of the prominent, busy street and right in the heart of the city center in Bangalore. A traditional and prominent street. And what was done was, it was a wonderful collaboration with the government department coming forward, Directorate of Urban Land Transport, along with, my research lab being a research partner to do impact assessment, and an international collaborator, Catapult UK, bringing their understanding of pedestrianization streets and their and initiatives and how it has worked in UK context. So what we did was we pedestrianized this street every weekend for 4 months continuous, and this was treated as a test bed to essentially understand how it impacts air quality, for example. There was also a metro rail station quite close to the street, so we also tried understanding how the ridership or the use of public transport, the metro rail system, as well as the nearby bus stops, how was that impacted because of this predestination. And likewise, and eventually what we tried understanding was how such initiatives have impact on improving quality of life. So this is something very importantly we have seen and experienced during this pandemic time, that when the lockdowns happened in different parts of the world, we actually saw a lot of improvement in air quality, for example. Yeah, when the streets were empty, there's a lot of positive things that we saw, while of course there were a lot of negative things about pandemic. So it has really brought forth the importance of quality of life, livability of cities. How do you sustain it and improve it? So we did this whole impact assessment in terms of quality of life, and it's a wonderful report. We released it just a couple of weeks back in a public function, and we did an international webinar on 1st of October. I can send these details. You can disseminate it among people. Almost a 450-page voluminous report summarizing how this has impacted and improved the quality of life, both in terms of qualitative factors, how visitors felt about it, how businesses on that street felt about it, how much of public transport gained its ridership, how was the air quality impacted, and so on. Maybe that's a wonderful case study that we can present from Bangalore to help understand how walkability can actually help in a larger goal or context of quality of life.
But there's a bigger problem with the way cities look at walkability. Cities have this really terrible idea that the amount of money that they spend on a certain mode of transport should depend on that mode of transport itself. So they're comfortable spending billions of dollars on metro, hundreds of thousands of dollars on cycling lanes, and maybe a few $1 million on buses. Nobody ever asks, what if you spend $1 billion on buses? Right? Frankly, if you can spend $1 billion, spend the $1 billion in the most useful way, not in the most expensive way. And I really think that is the problem, that in effect, because we don't spend significant amounts of money on pedestrianization, cycling, and bus, we end up spending inordinate amounts of money on crack-based solutions, which are just infinitely costlier for the same value that they deliver, or sometimes don't even deliver much value because they tend to connect far-flung locations, which create all kinds of other infrastructure costs. So in some sense, there has to be, whatever is the opposite of density, sort of a tax against de-densification. It's almost like in cities, they have this thing that says vacant properties are taxed, right? So in a sense, that there has to be a commuter tax as well on traveling too far to come into the city, because you're effectively asking for public transport systems to provision that travel at incredible cost, when that same money could do a hell of a lot more in the city itself. And I think, in Washington, D.C., I mean, I've lived in D.C. for a few years, and maybe in New York City too, I think they have experimented with these kinds of thinking about saying that people that come into the city, they really are, yes, they're creating economic value, but they're also creating economic footprint. And we need to understand, what the trade-offs are here and how to price some of these things. Fundamentally, and then the housing problem, which is, there's a lot of NIMBY stuff about where housing gets located. And we're not able to keep up with the demand for housing. In Bangalore, I don't even think that we're issuing 40% of the building plans approvals that are needed on an annual basis, which means 60% of the people are doing something informal, which isn't strictly approved by planning law. And they're also doing it in ways that are difficult to work with because they're not part of your planning framework. So unless the rapidity with which non-mobility functions, especially housing and employment concentration, if you don't have a responsive system for those things, then you're sort of, I remember a policeman once telling me, the planners don't do their job. The water supply guys don't do their job. The electricity guys don't do their job. Always everybody doesn't do their job. And then they expect the cop on the street to manage all of these situations as though I'm sort of a master expert in 7 different professions that have already failed. So, that's just not fair, that when we don't have an integrated approach, we effectively end up putting a few frontline workers. And that's really what happened to the health system. The guys who were supposed to be doing stuff to prevent these sorts of things were happening were sleeping on the job. And we expect nurses and frontline health workers to compensate for things that really ought to be done by much more responsible layers of government.
If I could jump in for a second, I think this is a really interesting conversation now that I can hear it, about the idea of a layered sort of approach to being able to get people kind of back into the density, the urban core. Here in Cleveland, as it was mentioned by one of the folks that were asking the question, we are losing population. And I think that we're not the only ones in a lot of different cities that, we're huge drivers for that manufacturing culture that you mentioned, Dr. Mahesh, and now maybe dissipated and moving out to the further reaches of the county and the city. I think it's going to be an interesting kind of switch to be able to talk about that first mile, last mile is what we call it here in Cleveland, to be able to have that gap between the last stop of our current service to the front door of the manufacturing site that now might be on the far fringes of the city. I do think we will have to be able to be nimble. We will have to be able to move our services around to meet that demand. When you're talking about rail, that's a little different. That's not as exactly movable. Your bus systems can definitely be moved. It has to be flexible. I wanted to be able to ask just a quick question on micro mobility in your areas. I'm not sure if you touched on that. If you have, I apologize in advance. But just the idea of being able to expand the idea of what public transit means for an urban area that might be shifting with people living outside of the urban core now and working outside of the urban core. How is micro mobility being handled in Bangalore and just in India overall? And then also, how does that sort of dovetail into the electrified vehicle conversation when you talk about electrified scooters, when you talk about shared mobility rides and on all of that? And I just was curious as to how that works in your areas and what the conversation may look like.
There are two interesting things that come to mind. I think a useful metric for any city would be to ask what percentage of for how much of the population, that is, what percentage of the population can we say that their first mile is also their last mile, right? I think we need to start thinking about this first mile and last mile and really create more people that travel only 1 mile, right? Because if you approach it from that, I remember, reading Gladwell many years ago, and he was talking about crime in Baltimore, and they were trying to solve this by saying how many more policemen can we add on the streets, and how many more cameras can we put on the streets, and all of that stuff. And eventually, somebody came up with the idea that, we have 13% of the people that live in this neighborhood are working professionals. We need to get that number up to 17%. And if you did that, your crime levels would drop automatically. So in a sense, you have to actually understand what is driving the outcome that you are pursuing and attack that problem. But when we tend to attack the technical and managerial aspects, we actually don't understand the social aspects that are driving the outcomes that we care about. So I would say, for Cleveland or for any other city, and it's a good number for you to actually get a handle on. What percentage of Clevelanders travel no more than 1 mile to their places of work, or no more than 2 miles or 3 miles to their places of work? And can you get that number up to 30% or 40%? If you get that number up to 30% or 40%, you're going to get the densification that you're going for. But if there aren't places of work for those people to go to, you're simply not going to get those numbers to go. So one possibility is to say that all these places, all these neighborhoods that are underutilized for whatever reason, dilapidation, abandonment, all of those kinds of things, can you turn them not into new housing but into new employment spaces? Right? Could those become remanufacturing centers, for example, like we discussed earlier? So in a sense, I believe that the historical tendency to revitalize housing through new housing is a mistake. Housing should be revitalized by whatever is most appropriate to create in order to drive concentration of housing. And sometimes the thing that you want more of is not housing, but actually employment or social infrastructure. So I think to have the spatial lens of saying what is driving the goals that we are seeking, and who are the people making those. I'd really be, if you have 20% of the people that are traveling less than three miles to go to a place of work, I'd study the hell out of them and figure out what exactly they're doing and see if I can make the other 80% live like that. And you'd have half your problems go away.
I appreciate that. It's an interesting perspective, and I conversation if you people will find a way to get there. Dr. Verma, if you had any thoughts on that subject, feel free to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of micro-mobility modes, shared modes. These are all evolving concepts being discussed quite extensively now in Bangalore and many other Indian cities also. And I think cities are still figuring out the best role that these modes can play, or these carpooling or shared mode services can play. Some of them have taken a hit during pandemic, especially the shared services, because of obvious reasons. Hopefully they will come back. But primarily on the last mile and first mile connectivity issue, especially to metro rail system, and we also have this urban rail system coming up in Bangalore in future. These micro mobility modes are increasingly being positioned as capturing this last mile and first mile, especially also because they can be more they can actually respond to more flexible and demand responsive requirement, rather than, as you were rightly saying, relying on fixed route and fixed schedule services, even for these feeder the first and last mile connectivity, because the land use pattern, as they change, the demand patterns also change. You would have to keep tuning your fixed services, fixed route and fixed schedule services. Sometimes they don't really work. So in to be able to provide a more flexible and demand responsive services, that's where I think these micro mobility modes can really play a very important role to bridge this first mile and last mile connectivity issue. And you also asked about the question of electric vehicles, and especially public buses. Of course, going electric. If we focus on electrifying public transport, definitely that's really the good way to think forward. Unfortunately, in Bangalore, we are still struggling to get electric buses due to more procedural procurement and other kinds of issues. The corporation is still struggling to understand whether they should buy outrightly, or they should go for a contract, leasing out kind of model. But hopefully that will happen soon. Cars, whether electric or not, we have to reduce their number. I think that's the bottom line. We should, of course, push them towards electric, but reduce their number at the same time. Yes, Ashwin. Yeah.
There's an interesting thing that's emerging, both for micromobility and for the climate footprint, and that is the electric bicycle. The electric bicycle in congested cities can do almost everything that your electric scooter can do at 1/3 of the cost or 1/4 of the cost. It might benefit from some design improvements, maybe for a modular carriage or a broader rear wheel or whatever. You can do things like that. But I can anticipate that there's a useful equity goal to pursue in getting a bunch of design guys in the city together and telling them, make a damn good bicycle or a damn good tricycle that's electric powered, and costs less than 1/3 or 1/4 of what a motorcycle or a scooter would cost, and can go at 20 kilometers an hour, 25 kilometers an hour tops. And that thing can cover 3-4 kilometers in I don't know 10-15 minutes. That's more than enough for a very large number of things. And there's a phenomenal equity goal to be pursued in something like this. You could probably afford to buy 1,000 of them each week and distribute them to people and let them use it for the cost of building one line of public transport in this metro line in the city. You could give every family 3 of these. So in a sense, you have to think about your budgets more creatively and say, look, de-link mode from budget reallocations and work from both sides of the spectrum, work from the bottom up and work from the top down. And whichever ones seem to go faster, drive those and don't worry too much about what your preconceptions about budgets are.
That makes sense. I think that being creative financially is absolutely something that has to happen to be able to think about ways to even introduce people into transit that haven't taken it before. I do know that we're definitely working toward that here in the United States, and really modeling after some of the big players, right? Like your New York cities. You mentioned that you had lived there for a few years. Even comparing that to some of the more rural areas. We have a lot of catch up to do. I do know I want to do a time check really quickly. Rosarita, if you would let us know if we need to wrap it up or if we have time for one more question.
We're scheduled from 1 to 2, but we don't have a hard stop technically. I know that it's late for Dr. Mahesh and Dr. Verma. Whatever they want to do. We have people still watching. We don't have anything lined up after this, so up to you two.
Well, I thought, Director Birdsong, I thought I'd answer your question about switching out from being a climatologist to being an urbanist in some way. I always tell people that trying to detect clouds at NASA is a lot easier than trying to solve public problems in a city. Well, that's a more linear problem. This is a far more non-linear problem in some way. I think everybody should get an education in public problem solving. We don't teach our kids enough of these things. In the morning, or a few hours earlier, I was on the climate panel with Jason Wood and a few others, and I was telling him I didn't get an opportunity to get to this in that discussion, but I really would like to encourage this to be tried in the city. Run competitions to increase the number of problem-solving people, right? Take $100,000 a year and create a competition that throws up 10 people who know how to solve problems. Just give them $10,000 and see what problem they can solve. If you're able to seed and create social entrepreneurs, public problem solvers at a steady clip, not as a one-time activity, but at a steady clip, that every month you should be creating one more person in the city who is effectively a public problem solver. And if you increase the number of public problem solving people, then that's the best bet for actually solving all of these problems. It's because we think of them as technical problems that we're looking for the technical solution. The social answer is to convert the people into problem solvers and let them work on whatever problems are in front of them.
I think that's a very good point you make. I put it in the chat when you said the $100,000 idea, right? We have something called the Paradox Prize here in Cleveland. I sit on the evaluation board for that, and I think it was a $600,000 pot, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around there. That was there to be able to generate ideas. So to your point, you've got to be able to kind of put your money where your mouth is and be able to get people interested in finding out what the next solution is instead of identifying what the next problem is. Kudos to you for moving into urban development from your kind of climate-induced research. It definitely is a harder problem, I think, and we appreciate you for it. If I could maybe close out with one last question, if that's okay. I did want to talk about really quickly the paratransit services and how that really works in your area, how that's operated as compared to fixed route services, but really how is it a decision point in the planning of cities and urban development? Is that a thought that's discussed before cities are laid out as far as the accessibility item when you deal with folks that are in wheelchair and or either deaf or blind or have any sort of perceived impediment to be able to get through the system?
Yeah, there are two things going on. Which one is that the absence of adequate provisioning of these kinds of services by the public system has led to the ad hoc emergence of alternatives in the private sector. A very large number of these alternatives tend to be, in fact, at the lower economic end of the spectrum, leveraged primarily by, increasingly by electric powered small vehicles, because that's very easy for your average mechanic to rig together in some way. 3 wheels, an axle, and a seat, and you've got something that can do something. And a lot of even the motorized electric manufacturing in India for cargo is actually 3-wheel cargo. It's not 4-wheel cargo. It's low wattage cargo vehicles, not high wattage cargo vehicles. So there's a lot of stuff that's possible in developing economies, which is literally leveraging the battery in some way. And you can build a lot of solutions around that. What this doesn't lead to is robust, large interventions on city scale. But maybe rather than fight that, you're better off improving how these things are organized at neighborhood scale and just strengthening what they do in each neighborhood, as it were, rather than trying to say, what are the implications of this for the city as a whole? One of the things that's sort of, I'm sure we're going to get into a problem with this. One of the things that governments have done is they've sort of said that electric vehicles at the low end of the spectrum don't need to be licensed, and people riding them don't need to have driving licenses. You can do that initially when a small handful of people are early adopters of this thing. When you have enough of those things moving at enough speeds, you're going to start to get into insurance problems and registrations and licensing, and all of that become a normal part of the spectrum. So in a sense, in any emerging possibility, a set of policies are adopted that actually are appropriate only until they remain emerging possibilities. And that if you don't quickly abandon them in favor of something else, you're going to end up with legacy problems for choices that you make first. And this is really what I meant by saying nimbleness is really the issue in a lot of public administration systems. If I could say one thing about the public administration system, in the private sector, I would aim for increasing the number of problem-solving people. In the public sector, I would increase the capacity of the government to administer things. Right? And I think both of these are important. And I think you have excellent supportive institutions like Cleveland Foundation and a few other, philanthropic entities in the city. If you can navigate those kinds of support towards these kinds of goals, rather than programmatic goals, if you can navigate those towards social goals, I think that even the programmatic value would be that much greater as a result. You're on.
Appreciate that. I think that's absolutely true. We here in Cleveland have actually changed our mission statement around from being more technical to actually being more programmatic and societally minded, if you think about it that way. Connecting the community is really simple, right? And we want to make sure to have those partnerships. So I think you're spot on. Dr. Verma, I will close it out with you if you have any last statements about any of the questions that have been asked. You two are definitely some very much subject matter expert, and we appreciate your time here. So go ahead and close us out if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think transportation system, or looking at how do you address the need or the issues in transportation system, have actually evolved over time from a pure engineering based approach earlier, where you were just interested in knowing how much more cars, for example, in the US context, it has always been like that traditionally, that you just try to understand, estimate how much more cars are likely to come on the road and what more infrastructure is required for that purpose, building roads, widening roads, other kinds of facilities and so on. But from there, we have really moved on to understanding today that it's only one subsystem, within the whole urban ecosystem, as well as it connects to climate, it connects to equity issues. It's actually enabler to move people and goods from one place to the other. It's not just about engineering, that how much more road you just build the road and forget, and don't think about what are the consequences of that. In fact, TRB, the Transportation Research Board in US, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, uh, initially when it started, it was Highway Research Board, and over these 100 years of its evolution, it has transformed from a highway research board to a transportation research board because of this realization. And that's what is happening, and that's what should happen everywhere, uh, to look at, not from the supply side of uh, approach, but to look at how you manage demand, and how do you also understand the causality between transportation system and its external environment, and how it impacts society, economy, climate, and so on and so forth. I think that's the approach going forward we have to follow, if we really have to see this in a holistic way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was I couldn't have asked for a better close. I think that is very very true. We have to be able to understand what our impact is on society, and a lot of it starts with mobility. So with that, I will go ahead and close us out, Rosarita, unless there's anything further from Global Cleveland for our two panelists.
No, that's all. I just want to say thank you so much. And also thank you so much for being so incredible during those technical difficulties. You guys are both amazing, and we thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for inviting. This was a really wonderful opportunity and an excellent session. Hope to see more in future. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I have both friends and family included.
Yes.
Perhaps one day I'll show up. Yeah.
Thank you all. We're so grateful for our panelists for sharing their expertise today, as well as our audience members for joining us today. We also want to thank our sponsors once again: Swagelock, Medical Mutual, Platform Brewery, Irish, The Links Incorporated, Corner 65, Us Together, 12 Literary Arts, as well as the Cleveland Public Library. We look forward to coming together again the week of October 17th for our 2022 Sister Cities Conference. Until then, stay well, and thank you for joining us. Have a great day.